I noticed something strange the moment I stepped into the hallway that morning. A kind of quiet that didn't belong in a house this big. And as I walked closer to the entrance, I saw boxes stacked against the wall, designer luggage, labeled cartons, storage trunks, lined up like a silent announcement someone forgot to tell me about. And for a second, I wondered if the staff was rearranging something. But then I saw Clara's handwriting on every label, bold and confident, like she had already claimed the space. And I stood there staring at her belongings in my mansion, the one my late husband and I built piece by piece over decades, wondering why a married woman with her own penthouse and access to more properties than she can count would suddenly decide my home was the place she needed to be. And the truth settled in quickly. This wasn't about needing space. Before we dive in deeply, if you're new here, please like the video, share it with someone who loves stories, and subscribe so you don't miss what happened next. Because what Clara said when she finally turned around changed the tone of the entire day and pushed the conflict much deeper than I expected. This wasn't about needing space. This was about getting closer to power, closer to the company I control, closer to the shares everyone pretends not to think about. And I kept watching in silence as she walked into the living room, humming, dragging her gold suitcase across the marble floor like she had been living here for years. And the calmness on her face told me she wasn't nervous. She wasn't unsure. She wasn't even waiting for permission. She had planned this, and she believed I would simply accept it because I am her husband's mother, and I have always been gentle with her. But as I stood there in the quiet sunlight of my own house, I felt something shift inside me, something steady and firm, something that reminded me that nothing in this home has ever moved without my say. And when she finally turned and saw me standing there, the smile she gave me was too calm, too prepared, too certain, and that made her next move even clearer, because before I could say a word, she opened her mouth and spoke a sentence that told me this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't temporary. She had come with intention, and she expected me to accept it. She looked at me and said, "Mom, I hope you don't mind. I'm moving in today." I didn't respond right away, not because I was shocked, but because her confidence told me she had already built the whole plan in her mind. And the way she casually adjusted the strap of her handbag while waiting for my reaction made me realize she expected me to stand there like a quiet gate she could walk through. And when I finally stepped forward, she smiled wider, as if my silence was permission, telling me she felt safer here and needed a stable place. But the words rolled off her tongue too easily, too rehearsed, and I watched her eyes, not the smile, because that's where the truth always hides in this family. And her eyes weren't looking at me with warmth. They were scanning the room behind me, calculating space, imagining routines, mapping out where she would position herself in my house and in my life. She walked past me without waiting, her perfume trailing behind her like a soft claim. And she stopped near the staircase with a confidence that didn't belong to a guest, touching the railing gently, as if checking its strength, as if imagining it as part of her daily morning walk. And when she turned back, she said she needed a home base, that my mansion felt right, that being here would be good for the family image, especially with investors coming next month. And that sentence told me everything. This wasn't about comfort. It was about proximity to the meetings, the paperwork, the places decisions are made. And she thought living under the same roof would give her influence. She couldn't earn any other way. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind her she had wealth of her own, homes of her own, choices of her own, because I wanted to hear how far she had taken this plan before I decided my next step. And when she picked up one of her boxes and carried it up 2 steps without hesitation, she paused, looked back at me, and said something so bold, so calmly delivered, that it showed she had already crossed a line she didn't even see. She told me, "I already sent someone to set up my things upstairs. I hope that's okay." I stared at her for a long second after she said that, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to understand the confidence behind her words, the kind that only appears when someone believes they've already won. And she kept walking up the stairs like she had been living here for years, her steps light, almost graceful, the steps of someone who believed the door had already opened for her. And I followed slowly, listening to the faint sounds coming from upstairs, realizing she hadn't lied. Someone really was in one of the rooms, probably her assistant, the same one who handled her shopping, her appointments, and her schemes disguised as errands. And as I walked up, I wondered how long she had been planning this, how many days she spent imagining herself waking up in this mansion, how many conversations she had with people outside this family about moving up in more ways than one. And when I reached the landing, she was already opening the door to the guest suite, as if she knew every inch of the house, turning on the lights, touching the curtains, stepping onto the soft rug-like. She was testing her new territory, and the assistant looked at me with a startled expression, the kind you give when you realize you've been caught doing something you shouldn't. But Clara just waved her hand casually and said, "Don't worry, she's fine with it," answering a question I never asked, rewriting my reaction before I even gave it. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her place her jewelry case on the dresser, my dresser, without hesitation. And I felt that quiet shift inside me again, the one that comes when you know something is no longer innocent, no longer harmless. Because Clara wasn't moving in, she was settling in, rooting herself into a place she wanted to reshape. And the way she smoothed the bedspread, the way she opened the closet doors, the way she checked the mirror, none of it looked temporary. She wasn't asking to stay. She was assuming she belonged here, that the house, the rooms, the decisions were all simply waiting for her arrival. And when she finally turned to me, there was no guilt in her face, only a calmness that didn't match the moment, only a softness that didn't belong to someone overstepping boundaries. She looked at me with a kind of patience, like she was waiting for me to accept something that was already done. Then she said, "Mom, I think this room will work perfectly until I move into the master wing." Her words settled in the room like dust, quiet but heavy, and I watched her walk across the suite with the calmness of someone who had already decided where she would sleep, where she would place her things, where she would stand in this house, as if it were a stage meant for her alone. And I stayed silent, not because I agreed, but because silence is sometimes the only way to see what a person truly wants. Clara kept moving with a confidence that made it clear she wasn't treating this as a temporary stay, but as the beginning of something she had already imagined in detail, something bigger than boxes and suitcases. She opened the balcony doors and let the breeze in, the same breeze my husband used to love. And for a moment, I felt him everywhere, in the walls, in the view, in the quiet reminder that this home was built with our choices, not with our ambitions. And she stood there admiring the garden like she owned the memory of it, not understanding that this house has history she cannot rewrite, no matter how many closets she fills. When she turned back to me, she spoke so softly I had to step closer just to hear her, as if the softness made her next words kinder. And she told me she wanted a space that represents her status, that living here strengthens the family image. And she kept repeating the word family like it was a shield protecting her true intention. But every sentence revealed the same truth. She wanted proximity to control, to the power I hold quietly, the decisions I make every day, the documents she pretends not to notice on my desk. I walked a little deeper into the room, letting her know I wasn't intimidated by her confidence. And she didn't step back. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain further. Instead, she placed her hand gently on my arm like she was soothing a child, and whispered something that told me she believed her plan was already too far along to challenge. Something that showed she thought I would let her take whatever space she wanted as long as she spoke softly enough. She leaned closer and said, "Mom, I hope you understand. I'll be taking the master wing soon because it suits my position in this family." I looked at her hand resting on my arm, light but entitled, and I realized she wasn't testing boundaries. She believed there were none, not for her, not when it came to what she wanted. And she walked past me again, touching the mirror frame like she was checking the texture of something she'd soon call hers. And I stayed still, letting her reveal the full shape of her plan before I said anything, because people like Clara always talk more when they believe you're agreeing in silence. He sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the comforter like a woman claiming territory, and she started explaining how the master wing shouldn't stay empty, how I spend most of my time downstairs anyway, how she could take care of things upstairs. And every word came out clean, rehearsed, charming. The way a person speaks when they've practiced the speech in front of a mirror long before the moment arrives. I watched her as she spoke about rearranging furniture, updating decor, installing her own security system. Subtle changes she framed as improvements. But I heard the truth under the surface. She wanted access to rooms that hold my safe, my files, my documents, my life with my husband. The things no one touches without my permission. She kept smiling, like she thought she was presenting a gift to me instead of trying to carve out power for herself. And when she said she would bring elegance to the wing, I almost laughed, not because she isn't elegant, but because she believed this house lacked something only she could provide. I shifted my weight, and she noticed, her smile tightening for a moment, the only sign she was waiting desperately for my reaction, the only crack in her confidence. And I let that silence stretch long enough for her to wonder if she'd pushed too far. But she recovered fast, standing up, brushing off her dress, as if preparing for the next part of her performance. And then she walked closer until she was only inches from me, lowering her voice in a way meant to sound intimate, persuasive, almost reassuring. And she said something that finally revealed the real heart of her plan. She whispered, "Mom, if I live here, I'll be much closer to the decisions you make about the company." I kept my face calm as her mother stepped out of the car like she owned the place, her eyes wandering over my driveway, as if she was measuring where her own car would be parked next. And I stood there with my hands folded, letting silence do the work. Because I learned long ago that rich people fear silence more than words. But inside my chest, there was a slow ache that reminded me of the years I built this house with my late husband brick by brick, while these people walked in like it was a prize waiting for them. And before I could say anything, my daughter-in-law rushed to her mother's side and whispered something too low for me to catch. Yet, their quick glances toward the mansion told me exactly what they were plotting. So I stepped closer, soft voice steady, and told them both that guests usually inform the owner before arriving with luggage. And the way their faces tightened told me the day was about to get longer. And then her mother tried to walk past me toward the front door. I moved a little to the side, not blocking her, just slowing her, the way my husband used to when someone disrespected our home. And I told her gently that stepping into a house without being invited was something we never did in our family. But she only gave me a thin smile, the kind that says she thought I was just noise in the background. And she kept walking, as if she had already decided her room, her routine, her place in my life. So I followed her calmly, while my daughter-in-law avoided my eyes, pretending to fix her scarf, though her hands were shaking, and I felt that old pain in my chest again. The pain of being treated small in a house I built through years of struggle, when nobody handed me anything. But I kept my tone steady as I said her name and told her we needed to talk before she stepped inside. And she slowly turned, annoyed, asking me what could possibly be so urgent. That was when my son's car turned into the driveway, much faster than usual. My daughter-in-law froze when she heard the sound of his tires on the gravel. And for a second, she looked unsure, like she hadn't planned for him to arrive this early, while I stood still at the doorway, watching his car stop so abruptly that the front dipped down. He stepped out without even closing the door properly, eyes locked on her like he already knew something was wrong. And I stayed quiet because I wanted to see who he would stand with first, his wife or his mother. So I watched him walk toward us with that tired, irritated look he only gets when he's been pushed too far. And when he reached us, he asked her why she was trying to enter my house without him there. And she stumbled over her words, saying something about surprising me and helping out, even though she still had her suitcase behind her. And I could see he was disappointed, not angry, but deeply tired. The kind of tired I used to see in his father when someone tried to use money or position to twist the truth. So I simply placed my hand on the doorframe and told both of them calmly that nothing bad had happened yet, but it would become bad if we pretended not to see what was happening right in front of us. And my son finally turned to her with a voice so low it shook me, asking her why she thought she could make decisions about my home alone. And before she could answer, my daughter came rushing out of her car at the bottom of the driveway, shouting my name like she had urgent news. My daughter's voice cut through the air so sharply that all three of us turned at once, and I saw her running up the driveway with her purse half open, hair flying, phone still in her hand, like she had jumped out of the car before even shutting it off. And something in her face told me she wasn't here for small family drama. Her eyes were wide, almost frantic, the way they used to get when she was a child, and knew she'd discovered something she shouldn't have. She reached me, out of breath, placed her hand on my arm, and whispered that I needed to hear something before anyone else said another word. And even though she was speaking quietly, my son and daughter-in-law could hear every syllable because the entire driveway had fallen silent. I watched my daughter look at the suitcase behind my daughter-in-law, then back at me, and I could almost feel her anger rising. The same slow, controlled anger she inherited from her father. The kind that doesn't explode, but tightens and sharpens like a blade. She held up her phone and said she had just come from the board meeting, one I didn't attend because I thought it was just routine quarterly nonsense. And she told me that something happened there that involved my shares, my authority, and my name. But before she could explain, my son cut in and asked what she meant, his voice suddenly sharper, and my daughter glanced at him, then at his wife, and that glance told me everything. She didn't trust the woman standing beside him. She didn't trust her even a little. I felt my stomach sink, because I realized this moment wasn't about a spoiled entry into my mansion. It was bigger, deeper, something planned behind closed doors, something that required meetings and papers and signatures. My daughter told me she overheard conversations, quiet conversations, about a vote that someone was trying to push through, a vote that would change my control in the company. And she said she heard a name being repeated more than once, a name that made her sick when she connected it to this sudden, uninvited arrival at my house. My daughter-in-law shifted her weight, trying to look relaxed, but her eyes flickered for just 1 second. And that 1 second told me she knew exactly what my daughter was referring to. My heart beat slower rather than faster, the way it always does when trouble steps into my home dressed like family. And I waited for my daughter to finish her sentence, to tell me what exactly she had heard about my shares, my power, and my position. But she swallowed hard before speaking, like the words might open a door none of us could close again. And then she finally said the one thing that made my son's face go pale. My daughter's words hung in the air like a storm about to break, and I could feel the tension ripple through the driveway. The kind of tension only money, power, and ambition can create in a family. My son's face went pale, his jaw tightening as he realized the depth of what had been said. And my daughter-in-law's confident posture faltered for the first time since arriving, as if she hadn't expected anyone to know what she had been planning behind the polished smiles and rehearsed conversations. And I stayed calm, arms folded, letting the silence grow heavy, letting her realize that every move she thought was secret had been noticed, that I always notice more than they think. Because years of running a company and managing family meant you learn to see ambition hiding in the smallest gestures. My daughter explained that during the board meeting, she had overheard my daughter-in-law speaking to 2 of my associates about influencing votes, convincing certain shareholders to approve a plan that would shift part of my control over the company. And she mentioned names casually, but the way she said them made it clear she was repeating something dangerous. And my son's eyes darted between the 2 of them, caught between his wife and his mother, torn by loyalty and disbelief. And I watched him process the betrayal, the manipulation, the audacity of someone trying to reshape a company I built without so much as a word to me. And I felt the familiar ache in my chest, the ache I always feel when someone tries to challenge my authority, not through skill, but through schemes. Clara, sensing the moment slipping, straightened herself, adjusted her hair, and smiled politely. But the confidence was slightly off, as if she realized this wasn't a simple house entry anymore. This was exposure, the first crack in the illusion she had built. And I could see the flicker of calculation in her eyes, the part where she tried to recover, to redirect, to claim innocence. But my daughter's voice cut through with precision, reminding her that she had been heard, that every whisper had been noticed. And I finally stepped forward, calm but steady. and reminded them both that the house, like the company, has rules. That power is not given to those who pretend to be helpful. That manipulation, no matter how polite, has consequences in my home, in my life, in the legacy I protect. And my daughter-in-law's lips parted as if to argue, but she paused, realizing that this game was bigger than she thought, that the mansion and the company were my territory. And as she looked between me, my son, and my daughter, she finally spoke with a voice just loud enough for all of us to hear, and she said something that revealed her full plan for the company and my life in one sentence. Her words hit the driveway like a sudden gust of wind, shaking the careful balance I had maintained in my home for decades, and I felt my chest tighten, not out of fear, but out of recognition. This was exactly the kind of manipulation I had anticipated, the kind that only surfaces when someone believes they have leverage. Clara spoke with calm precision, outlining a vague yet threatening plan that involved taking control of key meetings, influencing decisions, and subtly shifting shareholders' loyalties in her favor. She phrased it as if she were doing me a favor, as if she were helping the family progress, while conveniently placing herself at the center of every outcome. And I watched her carefully, noting the rhythm of her sentences, the confident lift of her chin, the way she believed she could intimidate me with her strategy, when in reality, she was only showing the depth of her audacity. My son's hands clenched at his sides, jaw tight, as he tried to absorb the audacity of his wife speaking about my company, my legacy, my decisions, as though she had the authority to shape them without consultation. And I noticed the shift in his posture, the protective instincts toward his wife colliding with the growing realization that someone was trying to bend the foundation of everything his family had built. And I could feel the tension spreading like an invisible net across the driveway, touching the walls of my mansion, the windows that had witnessed decades of my control, my decisions, and my husband's silent guidance. My daughter's eyes, wide and steady, darted between me and Clara, silently conveying that she understood the full scope of what was being attempted. And she whispered under her breath, though loud enough for me to catch, that if I didn't act carefully, the very people I trusted would attempt to rewrite the story of my company, my house, and my authority. And I felt the old familiar surge of calm determination. Years of navigating boardrooms, shareholder conflicts, and family manipulations had trained me to wait, to observe, to listen, and then to act with precision that leaves no room for misinterpretation. And Clara, noticing the weight in my gaze, smiled politely, adjusting her handbag and standing straighter, as if trying to maintain control. But the unease in her smile betrayed her confidence, just slightly. And I knew this was the first crack in her assumption that she could move into my home, into my life, and into my company without consequence. And before she could continue defending her audacity, I spoke, my voice calm but firm, reminding her that this house, like my company, is not navigated by rehearsed speeches or casual plans. And I told her that any attempt to take control without my consent would have immediate consequences. She wasn't prepared for. Clara's face flickered with something I had seen before in people who misjudge the strength of the person they're up against. An almost imperceptible pause, a hesitation she tried to hide behind a polite nod, but I could see it clearly, and I knew she realized for the first time that I wasn't a grandmother who would simply smile and allow her ambitions to creep into my home and my company without challenge. And I felt a quiet satisfaction in that realization, because years of experience had taught me that patience and observation are far more powerful than anger, especially when dealing with those who underestimate your control. My son stepped slightly forward, his expression conflicted, torn between defending his wife and acknowledging the truth that she had overstepped boundaries he didn't even fully understand yet. And I watched him struggle, because loyalty and family are never simple when ambition is involved. And Clara, noticing his hesitation, attempted to regain the upper hand by lowering her voice, speaking carefully, almost coaxing, about how she only wants to help, how proximity makes her more efficient, how she wants the family to appear united in front of investors. But I could see through the rehearsed words, the practiced smile, the manipulation hidden in the carefully chosen phrases, and I remained silent, letting her ramble, because every word revealed more about her true intentions than she imagined. Access to my decisions, to my shares, to the life my late husband and I built, and I wanted to hear it all before making the next move. My daughter, sensing the opportunity, stepped closer to me, whispering quietly, warning me that Clara's plan extended further than I realized, that it wasn't just about a bedroom or convenience. It was about the control of documents, influence over board members, and slowly embedding herself in positions of power while we remained unaware. And I nodded subtly, feeling a controlled calm wash over me, because when people mistake silence for weakness, they are about to learn that patience can be far more dangerous than confrontation. Clara's smile remained, almost perfectly maintained, yet I could see the smallest quiver at the corner of her eyes, the tiny twitch that betrayed her calculation that she was not as untouchable as she believed. And I finally spoke, my voice steady, deliberate, echoing slightly across the marble floor, telling her in a tone that was soft, yet unyielding, that this house, my life, and my company are not open to improvisation or self-assumed authority. And I added that anyone attempting to overstep will find that I have already planned far more than they could imagine. Clara's composure wavered for the briefest moment, the flicker in her eyes revealing that she had not expected me to speak with such calm authority, the kind that carries decades of experience and wealth. And I could feel the tension tighten in the air around us, wrapping the driveway and the front hall in a quiet storm. Because power in families like ours is rarely contested openly. It's subtle, measured, and unrelenting when challenged. My son shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between me and his wife, unsure whether to defend her ambitions or acknowledge that her plan was reckless. And I watched him carefully, noting how his instincts wrestled with reason, how he had been raised to trust his wife, yet could see with his own eyes that she had crossed a line, one that jeopardized not only the house, but the company we had all built from scratch. Clara straightened, her lips tightening slightly, the only hint that she felt the weight of my presence and the quiet authority I carried. And she started speaking again, soft and deliberate, attempting to frame her intrusion as a strategic choice, emphasizing family unity and her willingness to support the household and take on responsibilities, while presenting herself as indispensable. But every carefully chosen word betrayed ambition rather than support. And I knew that if I spoke too soon, I would give her the opportunity to redirect, to manipulate, to spin the narrative in her favor. So I remained silent, watching, observing, letting her reveal the full depth of her plan. My daughter, standing just behind me, whispered under her breath, warning that Clara's plan extended beyond mere residence. It involved subtle positioning in board decisions, influencing key employees, quietly shifting dynamics so that she could eventually claim authority over the company without confrontation. And hearing this, I felt the familiar surge of calm anger, that controlled determination I had learned from years of running businesses and protecting family assets. Because in families like ours, audacity is always tested, but patience and strategy win far more than quick confrontation. Clara, sensing that the balance had shifted subtly, took a step back, adjusting her scarf, her voice dropping even softer, trying to reassert control with charm and logic. But the spell was broken. I had seen the map of her moves, and she had underestimated not only my awareness, but my decisiveness. And I finally addressed her, voice quiet yet sharp, emphasizing that this house, my life, and my company are governed by rules she cannot bypass. And anyone who believes they can manipulate these without consequence will quickly discover that I have eyes everywhere. And patience is far more dangerous than anger. The slight falter in Clara's composure did not escape my notice. She had believed her careful planning, her polished words, and her confident steps would allow her to take control quietly. But standing there in my mansion, surrounded by the walls built by decades of my labor and my late husband's vision, she finally realized that influence here cannot be earned by mere presence or rehearsed speeches. And I felt a calm satisfaction, knowing that her first lesson in underestimating me had already begun. My son's expression shifted again, caught between the loyalty he felt toward his wife and the growing understanding that her ambitions threatened the balance of the family. And I watched him, not needing him to act yet, simply letting him observe the reality that I always manage both house and company with precision, patience, and an unshakable sense of control. And that any attempt to bypass that control would be met with consequences he could not ignore. Clara straightened quickly, adjusting her handbag, attempting to reclaim the narrative. And she spoke again, soft, measured, emphasizing family harmony, claiming her presence was beneficial and needed. And even as she did, I noticed the subtle microexpressions, an almost imperceptible clenching of her jaw, a slight narrowing of her eyes, a breath she held too long. That betrayed the tension beneath the surface, and I realized that she had been rehearsing charm as armor, hoping it would shield her ambitions. But the quiet strength I projected was a wall she could not pierce. My daughter, standing silently beside me, whispered again, just loud enough for me to catch, detailing what she had observed about Clara's recent moves, meetings with board members, subtle inquiries about key shareholders, and casual comments designed to gauge my awareness. And I felt the familiar surge of quiet resolve, the one that tells me patience and strategy will dismantle any scheme before confrontation is necessary. Because in wealthy families like ours, audacity is common, but careful observation always prevails. Clara, sensing the shift in atmosphere, tilted her head slightly, trying to recapture dominance with a soft tone, attempting to frame her ambitions as generosity and foresight. But her eyes betrayed her true intent, and I knew she understood that I had already mapped every move she had made, every conversation, every whispered suggestion. And the mansion, like the company, is mine to protect and navigate. And my patience is my advantage. far more dangerous than anger or confrontation. So I looked her directly in the eyes and said, calm and deliberate, "If you believe your presence here gives you authority, you are about to learn that control is never given. It is earned, and I decide when it is earned." The moment those words left my mouth, the silence in the entrance hall deepened, settling between us like a slow-moving shadow, and I watched Clara's smile flatten into something more rigid, something that revealed the strain behind her practiced charm. And for the first time since she stepped onto my property, she understood that I did not need to raise my voice or threaten her to make my authority unmistakably clear. My son shifted beside her, uncomfortable, because he had never seen his wife's plans challenged so directly. Yet, he also knew me. He had grown up watching me dismantle problems with precision instead of noise. And the look in his eyes told me he realized this was not going to be one of those moments where Clara simply talked her way into a comfortable position. She inhaled slowly, lifting her chin as if steadying herself for another attempt. And she began speaking about how living closer was meant to create family unity, how my age required support, how helping me manage the mansion and the company would lighten my load. And though she said the words with soft, respectful tones, every sentence was layered with a quiet assumption that she expected me to step aside someday soon, and she wanted to be in position when that time came. But I had built this empire with my late husband from nothing, and I had endured boardroom wars, legal battles, and business storms far harsher than an ambitious daughter-in-law who believed proximity would grant her power. And I watched her carefully as she spoke, noting how her eyes flicked around the foyer, the grand staircase, the chandelier, the art lining the walls, as if imagining it all under her influence. And that was the moment I understood how deeply her intentions ran. My daughter leaned closer, her voice barely above a breath, reminding me that Clara had already been asking employees subtle questions about financial reports, about the structure of the trust, about upcoming expansions, moves she shouldn't even know existed yet. And a quiet resolve settled over me, the same steady focus I felt whenever the company faced a threat that arrived smiling. Clara continued, layering charm over ambition, insisting she wanted to maintain the family legacy. But I could hear the hunger beneath her words, and the mansion, with its hush and its memories, seemed to listen with me. When she finished, expecting compliance or at least a softened stance, I stepped forward, slow and intentional, letting my heels click across the marble. And I told her in a calm, unbroken tone that legacy is not protected by those who try to take shortcuts into power, and that anyone who assumes they can step into my life, my decisions, or my home without permission will discover that I always act long before they think I've noticed. Her expression froze for a fraction of a second, the kind of stillness a person cannot control when they hear something that unsettles them more than any raised voice ever could. And I watched the realization settle into her posture, slow, reluctant, and heavy, that I had been aware of her intentions long before she thought she had hidden them. She blinked twice, steadying herself, trying to hold onto the last bits of confidence she walked in with, and she attempted a soft laugh, the kind meant to brush off tension, but it came out thin and sharp, revealing more anxiety than amusement. My son took a slow breath and looked at me with the expression he used to have when he was a boy caught between honesty and fear. And I could see the guilt forming behind his eyes, because somewhere inside him. He knew Clara had crossed a boundary so clearly that even he could not defend it. Clara stepped forward, only half an inch, but enough for me to see the shift. She was no longer pretending to sound helpful. She was adjusting her strategy, preparing for a different angle, one that relied on emotional framing rather than logic. And she began talking about how lonely I must be in such a large house, how hard it must be to manage everything without my husband, how comforting it could be to have younger help around. Her voice laced with crafted sympathy meant to soften me or make me doubt my strength. But sympathy from someone who wants something is the sharpest knife in wealthy families. And I felt the familiar rise of calm clarity, the kind that kept me standing through years of negotiations where people smiled while plotting. And I let her finish her entire performance without interrupting once. My daughter narrowed her eyes at Clara, recognizing every tactic, every rehearsed inflection, because she had seen the same tricks from investors who thought they were smarter than us. And she whispered again, reminding me that Clara had recently made trips to the corporate office without mentioning it to anyone, walking through departments she had no reason to be in, asking casual questions about the upcoming quarterly meeting. I kept my gaze steady on Clara, watching the way she tried to appear warm, the way she folded her hands gently in front of her, the way she angled her head to appear soft and harmless. But her ambition pulsed through every gesture, every breath. And I knew she had not come here today out of impulse. She had come prepared, with plans already forming in her mind. So I stepped closer, bringing myself just within her personal space, not threatening, simply undeniable, letting her feel the presence of someone who has survived more, built more, lost more, owned more, and protected more than she could possibly grasp. And I spoke in the same soft voice I had used in boardrooms when the room needed to remember who held the real power. I told her that loneliness does not scare me, age does not weaken me, and help is something I choose, not something pressed into my home by someone hoping to benefit from proximity. And as the words sank into the tension around us, I watched her shoulders tighten ever so slightly, because beneath her charm, she understood that I was not someone she could move, manipulate, or quietly replace. And that realization was only the beginning of what she would face next. Clara's breath caught for just a second, so brief that anyone else might have missed it, but I had spent too many years reading the quiet reactions of people who wanted something from me, and I knew instantly that my words had landed in the exact place she didn't want touched, the part of her that still believed she could maneuver her way into my life, into my home, and eventually into my company without facing any resistance. She tried to steady herself, pressing her lips into a polite smile, but her fingers tightened around her handbag until the leather strained, and my son noticed it too, glancing at her with a mixture of confusion and concern, as though he was finally beginning to see the cracks in her intentions that he had ignored for too long. She spoke again, slower this time, almost rehearsed, saying she only wanted to help the family move forward, that the company needed fresh direction, and that she had ideas that could elevate the brand. But each phrase held the unmistakable tone of someone positioning themselves for control, someone who had already imagined herself sitting in board meetings, signing documents with my authority, living inside the power she had not yet earned. My daughter shifted closer to me, her voice barely a whisper, as she reminded me that Clara had recently spoken to 2 senior managers, both of whom she had no relationship with, asking them about our international investments and the projected returns for next year, information she could only be fishing for if she intended to make moves behind the scenes. And hearing that made something inside me settle into a deeper, colder calm. I watched Clara closely as she continued her soft performance. Her voice dipped in sweetness, but her eyes sharp with calculation, and I realized that she was not just trying to move into my home to be closer to family. She was trying to place herself in the center of our financial structure, believing physical proximity would give her a natural path to influence decisions, guide conversations, and subtly gain authority where she had none. My son rubbed his forehead, clearly conflicted, because even he couldn't deny that the timing of her sudden concern for me made no sense. And he looked at me almost helplessly, as though he expected me to solve this without forcing him to take sides. And he wasn't wrong. This wasn't the moment to turn it into a war. This was the moment to draw a boundary so sharp it could not be crossed again. So I stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between us, not with aggression, but with a quiet weight that comes from being the foundation of a family, the one who built everything that everyone else now enjoys. And I told her that proximity to power does not grant it. Access to wealth does not entitle anyone to control it, and no one, no matter how politely they ask or how carefully they plan, moves into my home or my company's decisions without my permission. Her smile broke then, just slightly, the first real fracture in her confidence, and I watched it carefully because that small break told me she finally understood that whatever plans she had made were not going to unfold the way she expected. Clara's eyes darted from me to my son, as if searching for an ally who might silently back her ambitions. But she quickly realized that no one in this driveway would act without my signal, and the sudden shift in her confidence was unmistakable. The careful, rehearsed steps she had taken to secure influence now seemed fragile, almost exposed, and I could feel the quiet power of presence settling over the scene like a weight that made every movement deliberate, calculated, and meaningful. My son hesitated, still caught between loyalty to his wife and respect for the matriarch who had built this house and the company from the ground up. And I noticed the tension in his shoulders, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his hands flexed slightly as if he were trying to steady himself against a truth he had been too polite to face before. Clara's presence was no longer a benign gesture. It was a calculated move to take control, and it was my responsibility to show her the boundaries clearly. My daughter stepped closer, almost instinctively, whispering under her breath that Clara had been quietly gathering information about our trusts and shareholder intentions, that her casual questions to staff were not innocent, and I felt a wave of controlled calm, knowing that observation was now my greatest weapon, that patience and strategy would reveal every hidden ambition before any confrontation escalated beyond control. Clara, sensing the atmosphere had shifted, began to tilt her head and speak in softer, more persuasive tones, repeating phrases about support, family unity, and helping with decisions. And I noticed the subtle quiver in her jaw, the tiny tightening around her eyes that gave away the tension beneath the calm veneer she was trying so hard to maintain. Her smile, meant to disarm and charm, now looked forced, strained, as if she had suddenly realized that charm alone could not move mountains built over decades. And I could see her trying to read the expressions of my daughter and my son, searching for weakness or hesitation, but finding none. The family was aligned in quiet observation, and even my son's loyalty could not overshadow the clarity that I had already established. I took a slow step forward, voice even, controlled, resonant with authority earned over years of navigating conflicts far more dangerous than this. And I reminded her that houses built on decades of care are not ceded to those who arrive with rehearsal and ambition alone. That control over life, money, and legacy is not given by proximity, and that patience is a far more formidable weapon than aggression. She faltered, blinked, and swallowed, realizing that the charm she had relied upon was now insufficient. And in that moment, before she could recover, I told her in a tone measured, but unyielding, that every step she had taken toward influence, every word she had spoken as if planning were permission, had been observed, and the consequences of misjudging my awareness would be immediate. And absolute Clara's face shifted from forced calm to something tighter, almost brittle, the kind of expression someone wears when they realize the foundation beneath their carefully laid plans is not just firm, it is immovable. And I could feel the subtle tension radiate from her as she adjusted her posture, trying to regain a sense of control she had never truly had in this driveway or this house. And I remained steady, silent, letting her flustered movements reveal more than her words ever could. My son glanced at me, conflicted, unsure whether to defend his wife or acknowledge the reality that her ambitions had overstepped boundaries that even familial loyalty could not excuse. And I knew in that instant that the lesson she would remember longest would not be taught through argument, but through the quiet, unwavering authority that emanates from someone who built everything by her own hands. She attempted to recover, her voice dropping to a soft, persuasive murmur about helping, supporting, creating unity, and stepping closer to my son, as if proximity would tilt him to her side. But even the smallest shift betrayed impatience, the subtle tremor in her fingers betraying the calculation she had relied upon so heavily. And I saw my daughter's eyes narrow slightly, recognizing the same tricks she had seen in ambitious investors and opportunists over the years, moves meant to test boundaries, see how far one could push before consequences arrive. And while I admired the skill in planning, I had built my life and empire to withstand such tests, and my mansion, my office, and my company were more than walls and contracts. They were extensions of decades of foresight, discipline, and vigilance that no casual manipulation could breach. Clara's lips parted as if to speak, but I raised a calm hand, letting the silence linger, heavy and deliberate, because silence in the presence of ambition is far more revealing than any confrontation. And she realized immediately that her carefully practiced phrases now served only to expose the depth of her plan, the audacity of her approach, and the fragility of her position. My son's shoulders tightened. He glanced at her with a mixture of awe, frustration, and understanding, as if he finally grasped the weight of what had been unfolding before him. His wife had crossed into territory that belonged to me alone, and no charm or rehearsed speech could rewrite the rules of authority in this house or in this family. I took a deliberate step forward, voice steady, eyes locked on Clara, conveying decades of controlled power, and reminded her that the mansion, the company, and the family's legacy are not playgrounds for those who assume they can bend influence to their will, and that patience, observation, and quiet strength always uncover truth before the loudest voices or the cleverest words ever could, and I told her that every move she made to insert herself into my life and my decisions would be met with consequences she had not even imagined. Clara didn't speak at first, and for a long moment, none of us moved, the cold air settling around us like a curtain before a final act. And I watched the truth finally settle in her eyes. The truth that she had stepped into a game she did not understand, one with stakes higher than she expected, and players older, quieter, and far more seasoned than she had prepared for. My son stood rigid beside her, his jaw tight, his hand hovering inches from hers, as if he wasn't sure whether to take it or let it fall. And I could see the shock beginning to wear off as responsibility slid back into place across his face. The responsibility of being the son of a woman who built an empire 2 hands at a time and buried her husband with half the family fortune still untouched. My daughter shifted her weight, arms folded across her chest, observing Clara with a calm that reminded me so much of her father, quiet judgment disguised as polite stillness. And I found myself thinking of the early days of the company, when I learned the hard way that wealth builds walls, but intention reveals who stands outside knocking. Clara finally swallowed, her voice thin as she said she only wanted stability for her future children. And the words might have landed differently if they weren't wrapped in entitlement, if the moving truck behind her wasn't still humming like a background confession. I stepped closer, keeping my tone low and even, and told her that stability is earned through trust, not taken through shortcuts, and that before she dreams of claiming space in my home, she must learn to respect the foundation on which it stands. Because this mansion has absorbed years of grief, discipline, loss, and rebuilding, things she has not yet learned to honor. My son squeezed the bridge of his nose, whispering her name in frustration, but she shrank back only slightly, her confidence flickering like a candle exposed to a steady wind. And for the first time since she joined this family, I saw her realize that being married to my son didn't make her an heir to my authority, my home, or my legacy. I turned to the movers and politely told them their services wouldn't be needed today, and the looks on their faces confirmed what I already suspected. They had been told to unload everything quickly, almost sneakily, as if speed would bypass permission. Clara's shoulders dropped. She whispered to my son that she thought it would make things easier, that moving in would streamline the family dynamics. And even he couldn't defend that line because he knew what it meant: simplify access, streamline influence, share control that was never hers to touch. I allowed a small breath, steady and slow, and told her that marriage gives her love, companionship, and belonging, but not ownership of what I built long before she arrived, and certainly not the right to walk into my home without invitation. She blinked fast, fighting back the embarrassment, and when her eyes met mine, I softened my expression just enough to remind her that I was not her enemy unless she chose to be. My son finally placed a hand on her shoulder, urging her toward their car, and I watched them walk away together, not defeated, but forced to rethink every assumption they walked in with. And as the moving truck pulled off the driveway, I stood quietly, letting the house settle again, knowing this day had drawn a sharp line that would define the months ahead. And I told myself that if Clara tried anything like this again, I would no longer meet her with warnings, but with decisions she could never undo. Thank you for watching, my loves, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. before we step into the next day of my life.